In the wake of the murders of people of color such as George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, Andres Guardado, and countless others, discussions surrounding systemic racism have been brought to the forefront. Systemic racism occurs when the racist beliefs and practices of the oppressive majority become ingrained in how an organization functions. I think systemic racism begins in more explicit and blatant forms, such as the enslavement of Africans in the South, Jim Crow laws, and the mass incarceration of Black men through the manipulation of the 13th Amendment, and then transforms into less conspicuous forms, such as allowing one's perceptions of a certain group as, say, less intelligent or more apt to be violent to influence the treatment of those groups, or allowing one's privilege to dictate choices surrounding the inclusion of certain texts.
Systemic racism is all about how racism is codified into our every structure in the US: government, education, healthcare, housing, law. You name it, white people benefit from it, and we benefit from it at the expense of Black people, brown people, indigenous people, other people of color. These systems uphold our privilege while actively suppressing those who are not white, hence the term white supremacy.
So I think a big part of how systemic racism is perpetuated is mainly through our education and our curriculum, because currently, like with classes like APUSH, you only learn about the bad parts of Black history and POC history. You never really learn about like their culture or the moments of greatness. Like we don't learn about Black scientists or inventors. We don't learn about Asian trailblazers. We only learn about slavery or building railroads. Like we only learn about the bad parts, so then we start to associate people of color with the bad parts of history.
When there's power to uplift and support, but there's also, unfortunately, power to oppress and disempower. And this is where this idea of systemic or institutional racism comes in. When we pair this definition, or this focus on the institutions that hold power, with the term racism, we are asked to question in what ways do those that hold power use this power to oppress marginalized groups. In what ways are our legal or justice systems, our schools and housing markets, our healthcare and employment systems harming and suppressing Black, brown, or indigenous people in the United States? To step back and kind of start to consider the countless ways our institutions oppress communities of color is a really hard task, especially for those that have the privilege not to think about it. This is because this arbitrary hierarchy, which places white people in positions of power, is a hierarchy that is historically rooted. Many aspects of our society are built upon racist concepts, and that means many of the things that we've grown accustomed to, we've grown to know as truths, are inherently and institutionally racist.
I've had experiences with systemic racism both as a child and as an adult. I can remember sitting in my white guidance counselor's office as an 8th grader selecting my coursework for my first year of high school, and being told that despite having earned a spot on the honor roll and principal's list for all 4 of my middle school years, I should not try to take any honors classes because they might be too difficult for me. Meanwhile, my white counterparts were being enrolled in honors courses regardless of their academic records. I also recall sitting in my white supervisor's office as an adult, my first year of teaching, and having read over the curriculum and the book options, I selected 2 novels by Black women to teach during my first semester. I was asked if I was trying to create a Black literature course. As a new teacher, I kept my mouth shut, but I remember thinking, A, if I am, why is that problematic? And B, apparently we have a white literature course, since the novels typically taught in the sophomore English curriculum are written by Shakespeare, Williams, Stevenson, Dickens, and Golding. Looking back, I wish I had spoken up, and I wish I had had the courage to defend my choices.
With my experience of systemic racism, I obviously am only feeling it as a white person, and I think that probably sounds weird to a lot of people that I even feel any part of it, because of how we see systemic racism. We only see it as something that affects Black people, when in reality it also affects white people, but in the opposite effect. So just as it's really hurting Black people, it's really helping white people. So as a white person, how I see systemic racism is the idea that I go to the doctor's office and have complete faith and completely trust my doctor to take me seriously, and when I say my symptoms, she's going to give me the adequate care that I need. When after taking a healthcare class in college, I've learned all about how from the same socioeconomic status, Black people and Black women specifically are taken much less seriously than white women. And when they say their symptoms, it's thrown off as like, oh, you're just stressed out, or like, you're being dramatic, when in reality, they're feeling the exact same things that I'm feeling, but I'm gonna be taken a lot more seriously. And that's a systemic thing, because not only is it just like a doctor's issue, but it has to do with how medical students are taught in med school and how that affects the healthcare system as a whole. Why are Black women dying 3 times more than white women during pregnancy?
My own experience with systemic racism is that as a white person, I didn't know it, I didn't understand it, I didn't grapple with it, and I didn't have to for a very long time. That's the definition of white privilege. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s, I went to grad school to become a teacher, that I really became exposed to and was open to learning about systemic racism.
I think that the first step to becoming a better ally and becoming anti-racist is to admit that systemic racism exists and that it pervades every aspect of American society. That police brutality is not a singular case, and that history impacts the present, which is why the racist ideologies that were born and established through the system of slavery, continued through segregation, and then continue into modern day society because the same group of people are in power.
I think right now in this movement and this moment, there are 2 main fronts that we have to find solutions within. There's the legislative front and there's the cultural front. And within both of those, you have to work within people and work within solutions. I think the cultural front is the front that right now we're focusing on the most, which is tearing down Confederate statues that never should have been built in the first place, and having deep and intimate conversations with our friends and our neighbors and our family members about things that maybe we feel uncomfortable talking about. And on the legislative front, we're helping to pass bills like no-knock warrants and anti-lynching bills, and I think overall, altogether, both of these areas, although they're very different in their ways that we find issues to solve systemic racism, I think both of them are really, really important, and both of them need equal attention within this movement. When we speak up about these issues, we should be talking about ways to make tangible changes within ourselves and within society.
Though many don't blatantly say it out loud, racism is very much alive, and it seeps into the educational, political, economic, and social spheres of our life. It's massive and it's sweeping, and it's in the prison industrial complex and the criminal justice system that literally profits from detaining Black bodies for as long as they can. But it's also discreet in, for instance, the lack of Black history professors at colleges, or the predominantly white population that is usually on college campuses, or, for instance, the denial of a job just because of a certain hairstyle that's labeled unprofessional. White people and non-people of color need to admit that this is reality in order to have a conversation, or begin to have that conversation that is crucial to taking steps towards change.
In terms of working towards change, white people need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and I'm speaking directly to white people as a white person. We need to force change and advocate, but we shouldn't be taking over from the Black leaders and organizations and movements who've been doing this work, because that's just centering whiteness all over again. The first step is education, and it's heartening to see so many people starting to do that work and better understand the insidiousness and sprawling nature of systemic racism, as well as how we're complicit and how we benefit. But that education needs to be coupled with action from challenging racist comments to whenever we hear them, and especially when they're coming from friends and family, to patronizing more Black-owned and minority-owned businesses, to making educated voter choices, to diversifying the art and literature and music and media we consume.
So when we start to question the power of these institutions and how they are using this power, what are we supposed to then do with this information? Well, the first step is, of course, acknowledging that inequalities that have been built into our society, our culture, and those institutions that dictate how our lives are structured. White peoples especially need to amplify and listen to Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices. They must use the power and the privilege that they are given simply because of the color of their skin to support the efforts of disempowered communities so that these communities may gain their rights that they should have had in the first place.
And I think that a big part of how we can start to help people understand and grow from systemic racism is by kind of showing that there is more than one side to a person of color or a Black person, because I think when we show them just as, a worker or just as someone that's so downtrodden, and people, they just get this image in their head of that's who a Black person is. They don't realize that they're artists, they're intellectuals, they're scientists. They can be just as much as any other person can be. And I think a big part of that is with education. And I think there's a lot of steps that we can do to change that, because a lot of our curriculum, it's easy to work in. Why can't we learn about the marginalized communities within this subject? With physics, we learn about only what the famous we only learn about Einstein. Why don't we learn about any of the Black scientists? Or why don't we learn about Neil deGrasse Tyson? We just don't. It's a willful ignorance, I think, because there's so many opportunities to make a change and to incorporate a more diverse education.
I just wanted to say that right now is such an important time, not only for right now, but for what has happened in the past and how things are going to be in the future, because whatever we're doing right now is impacting everything of how things are going to be. So I think that I want to say this, that no action is too small and everything you do is valid, because it's all adding to this one great thing that is going to make things different and can help so much for the future. And Black Lives Matter is fighting for Black lives and fighting for equality of the world and making sure and helping towards the cause of helping everybody feel accepted, feel loved, and feel just as important as any other person. Because no matter your gender, your sexuality, your religion, your race, ethnicity, the color of your skin, anything, you are important. And it's important that I'm saying this because no matter who you are, you can come into this movement with your own take on it, with your own experience, and you can fight towards it yourself with this movement, because it's for everybody, because it's for our future.